With these somewhat recent changes to Black Mage, it might be interesting to take a look back at all the overhauls and simplifications of the other jobs throughout the years. Whether you were there to experience it or want to hear a bit of history. Naturally, Gunbreaker, Dancer, Sage, Reaper, Viper, and Pictomancer are not included as, aside from the Noxious Nash change super early in Viper's life, none of these jobs received any changes significant enough to qualify as a simplification or overhaul or rework. This could feel like a bit of foreshadowing too, as all of these jobs came out at the oldest Shadowbringers. Now, if you feel I overlooked something, or perhaps a job had multiple reworks and you felt I missed an important detail as a result, do be sure to let me know in the comments. But with that, let's get to it. Before we get to actual job-specific changes and overhauls, I feel it is reasonable to mention that certain expansions made some general sweeping changes that will definitely appear throughout this list, but two major changes that are not job-specific enough to target at the job, but were significant enough that they are noticeable, are the removal of just a lot of random dots to maintain, as well as the damage type down debuffs. With the release of Stormblood, a lot of jobs lost a dot. For some, this meant they went from having a dot to not having one. For others, it meant they simply went down one. For example, Warrior used to have a dot called Fracture, Dark Knight used to have a dot called Scourge, Dragoon had one called Phlebotomize, Monk had one called Touch of Death, Machinist even had one called Lead Shot, but all of these were removed in Stormblood. While not a huge deal since each one were just one dot to manage, having a dot to check in on every 30 seconds can be quite a massive difference from not having that. Similarly, with the release of Shadowbringers, debuffs that make enemies more vulnerable to piercing, slashing, or blunt damage were removed. Essentially, imagine a debuff similar to Reaper's Death's Design, but it increases damage taken from a specific type of physical damage. For a lot of jobs, it was simply a part of the interior as they applied the debuff and made use of it as part of their normal rotation. In other cases, a job might rely on someone else to apply it. The slashing resistance debuff was probably the least contentious, which says a lot actually, as it was applied by Warrior, Samurai, and Ninja, but in addition to those, both Paladin and Dark Knight relied on the debuff to maximize their damage. Meaning that you pretty much needed a Warrior or a Samurai or Ninja in your raid, as you were bound to have at least a Paladin or a Dark Knight too. The piercing resistance debuff was, on the other hand, probably the most contentious, as it was exclusively applied by Dragoons, but in addition to them, was relied upon by both Bard and Machinist, and the physical portions of the Red Mage, which effectively meant that if any of those three were present in your party, a Dragoon sort of felt mandatory too. You can probably see how this could cause some optimization problems already. The blunt resistance debuff, on the other hand, just felt a bit gratuitous, as it was exclusively applied by Monk, but the only other jobs that saw any use for it aside from the Monk itself were mages and casters that didn't really care. A reasonable argument as to why this feature was removed from the game is that if every job that relies on such a debuff applies it inherently, then it might as well just be a debuff for them, like Death's Design, or just be a damage buff for them even. On the other hand, to make such a debuff significant, you need jobs that benefit from the debuff without being capable of applying it, as seen with the piercing debuff especially. However, the knock-on effect of that design is that it means that it feels like if you have a Bard or a Machinist, you're forced to also have a Dragoon, for instance. So either way you slice it, either the feature feels meaningless, or it requires specific team compositions to really work. And indeed, at certain points, specific jobs were slightly better at applying their resistance debuffs. For instance, Warriors applying theirs naturally as part of their rotation, where Ninjas had to deviate from their normal rotation to maintain it, which is somewhere in between the two extremes presented. A few additional asides is that Shadowbringers getting rid of the TP resource also came with the change that many jobs suddenly were given AoE combos, where before they just had an AoE attack. Shadowbringers also simplified enmity management, removing tank and DPS stances from tanks, as well as their enmity combos, among other things. But now, with those rather universal overhauls covered, let's get to actual job overhauls and simplifications, starting with the tanks. Warrior's Inner Release. This action went through a bit of a journey in Stormblood, but the most well-known original effect of Inner Release, which was not even its first one, was simply that it made all of your attacks guaranteed critical direct hits, and also removed all beast gauge costs for 10 seconds. Originally, Onslaught and Upheaval had beast gauge costs, so this meant that during Inner Release, Warrior would throw both of these attacks for free and also get critical directed auto attacks on top. Because the buff only lasted 10 seconds though, Warriors were incentivized to have enough skill speed to sneak in 5 Fell Cleaves during it, which was possible due to the buff being applied later in the animation log of Inner Release itself. In Endwalker, Inner Release was gradually changed to the current incarnation where it simply gives you 3 Fell Cleaves or Decimates, and doesn't affect anything else. Before these changes, Inner Release had a longer cooldown of 90 seconds as well, meaning 5 Fell Cleaves you had to work for instead of 3 Fell Cleaves every minute. Paladin. Before the overhaul of Endwalker, Paladin's rotation was extremely rigid, maintaining a dot applied by Goring Blade, which was an alternative combo finisher to Royal Authority. Fight or Flight also only increased physical damage, and Requiescent gave you 5 stacks that could be spent on Holy Spirit, but was fully consumed by Confiteor, similar to Reaper's Communio. This meant that the rotation split up into 25 seconds of Fight or Flight physical rotation, starting and ending with Goring Blade, into 20 seconds of Requiescent magic rotation, and then 15 seconds of downtime rotation. Because of this design, Paladin also had an incredibly hard time adjusting to the 2-minute burst meta, which truly came to power in Endwalker. The overhaul making Fight or Flight all damage and removing the dot to manage made Paladin's rotation a lot more flexible. Notably, atonements used to break combo, and so to make the Paladin rotation loop properly back then, it was common to skip 1 or even 2 atonements in the downtime part of the rotation. Quite a strange rotation, really. Dark Knight. Before Shadowbringers, Dark Knight had an action called Dark Arts, which was the primary, but not even close to exclusive, way they spent MP. Dark Arts enhanced the next action they used that happened to have an interaction with Dark Arts. This meant certain defensive cooldowns, Dark Mind included as an example, could be boosted this way. However, even something as simple as Soul Eater could also be boosted, which means that spending MP on defense could be considered a damage loss. The horror! So, with Shadowbringers, Dark Arts and most other MP spendings were replaced with the Edge and Flood of Shadow actions. TBN used to give a kickback of 50 blood gauge if it broke as well, instead of the freebie edge it gives now, named Dark Arts. An additional side is that Delirium in Shadowbringers worked similar to Inner Release, minus the crits and direct hits, so it probably comes as no surprise that Endwalker similarly made that one into 3 free uses. Blood Weapon also worked in the same way of making all of your GZDs recover MP for 10 seconds until it was made into 5 guaranteed MP recoveries, until Dawntrail merged it with Delirium. In fact, before Shadowbringers, Blood Weapon also made your weapon skills have a shorter GZD to boot. Next up, Healers, starting with White Mage. Before Shadowbringers, Secret of the Lily was way more complicated. Every time you cast Cure or Cure 2 in combat, you would gain a Lily, up to 3. When you used Asylum, Assize, Divine Benison, or Tetragrammaton, all of the lilies would be consumed immediately to reduce the cooldown of that action by 4, 10, or 20% depending on lily count. In a world where Cure 1 and Cure 2 are used frequently, this seems pretty decent, but in a more offense-focused metagame, the lilies are immediately observed as a way to recuperate damage loss by getting more Assize casts throughout a fight. Imagine if White Mages still had this version today, instead of having the lily spells. Scholar. Before Shadowbringers, Scholar had 2 dots to maintain instead of just 1. White Mage also did actually. Notably, Bio 2 and Miasma. For AoE, they also had Miasma too. And they even had access to Bane as an Etherflow spender that spread their dots to other enemies, similar to PvP Scholar's deployment tactics. With Shadowbringers, Miasma and Bane were made exclusive to Summoner. Scholar's pets were also simplified to just be skins. Originally, Eos had Whispering Dawn and 2 actions that got combined into Fey Illumination. Selene instead had a small haste boost they could use on one player with 50% uptime, an AoE Ishuna, and an Interrupt. Well, the mini-silence that they were before Shadowbringers, but still. Finally, there was actually a short time frame of Shadowbringers where Scholar lost energy drain, as it was also meant to be exclusive to Summoner. Astrologian. Look, their cards, or the systems attached to them, have been changed, reworked or overhauled in every single expansion since their inception. The only real exception being Stormblood, where they mainly built on top of what was already there. Mainly. A somewhat reasonable rule of thumb with Astrologian is to never get too attached to the card system, because it is probably changing again. Another major change to Astrologian separate from the cards were that with Shadowbringers release, Astrologian lost all actions related to buff duration extensions, as they both had a way to increase the duration of their buffs on one target and one for the entire raid by 15 and 10 seconds respectively. All these things made Astrologian insanely swingy depending mostly on luck and whether you got the cards you needed or not, which is luck. Also, with the release of Sage and Endwalker, Astrologian lost access to Diurnal and Nocturnal Sect, making them just a pure healer instead of being able to switch as needed. Moving on to mages, we're going to skip Black Mage due to how recent its changes are. So let's begin with Summoner. Before Endwalker, the job had a very scatterbrained design, trying to both be a dot job, a pet management job, and have a burst that completely throws away both of those two other things. In their final incarnation, they maintained dots with an OGCD, Tri-Disaster, 3 out of the 4 applications in a 2-minute loop, and on AoE, spread it with Bane, which simply was a short cooldown with no cost. Pets were also rather simplified. Ifrit was for single target, Garuda was for AoE. Titan technically had a defensive cooldown in it, but came at a DPS loss, so probably not. And the primal summons alternated between Bahamut, which did not change your actions but attacked every time you did, and Phoenix, which changed your rotation to alternate between a single target and empowered AoE attack, both of which were instant. The biggest problem with this version of Summoner was the slow reaction of pets, which made the job incredibly janky to play. Ironically, many of these problems were fixed with the release of Endwalker, where Summoner was reworked so no longer cared anyway. Red Mage. Before Shadowbringers, Scatter was a fast spell and Red Mage's only AoE spell. But Thunder and Arrow 2 didn't exist. When Jolt was cast, it always gave you Impact ready, which was an alternative to the Fire and the Stone, increasing consistency. Before Endwalker, Moulinet didn't even lead to the magic part of the burst, and the full melee combo also cost 80 of both mana types. Although you also generated proportionally more mana, meaning melee combos sort of had to be used right when you got them. Monification also doubled whatever mana you had instead of giving you a set amount. And finally, originally, Acceleration guaranteed the Thunder and the Arrow procs instead of what it does now, although it gave 3 stacks of such an effect. Note, it meant only guaranteeing the procs, no instant casting. Bard. The big thing that always changes with Bard is their songs. Originally, Mage's Ballad and Army's Paean were auras that recovered MP and TP respectively, while reducing the Bard's own damage output. Wanderer's Minuet was also a toggled effect that massively increased the Bard's damage, while putting cast times on their attacks. In Stormblood, the 3 songs were reworked to have the effects they have now, except the repertoire effects happened when your dots crit ticked. This sounds worse than it is, but Bard did have a maintained 10% crit chance buff from straight shot, sort of making it bearable. Shadowbringers then changed it to a flat 20% chance and 40% chance when your dots ticked, with the greater chance being on the upgraded dots. In Endwalker, it was changed to the way it works now, where it just procs as it ticks itself, and then Dawntrail removed the need for a target to activate the songs in the first place. Machinist received a major rework with the release of Shadowbringers. Before, even its 1-2-3 combo worked differently. Step 1 had a 50% chance to enable Step 2, which had a 50% chance to enable Step 3. But as it wasn't actually a combo, there was nothing preventing you from using 1 until you got the proc, then 1-2 until you got the proc, and then use everything. And additionally, they had an ammo system that increased the potency of their gun attacks while also guaranteeing procs. Hotshot also maintained a damage buff on the Machinist. They also had 2 auto turrets, Rook being single target and Bishop being AoE. These were more like pets that you simply placed and had all the time. Before Stormblood, these turrets could also be switched to a mode that effectively did the same thing as the MP and TP recovery versions of Mage's Ballad and Army's Payon. And of course, Machinist also could switch to having cast times. They also had a heat gauge that turned their 1-3s into heated versions doing more damage, and overheating gave a damage buff but meant you couldn't access heat for a bit after. Flamethrower was actually used to help manage this mechanic, meaning it had a single target purpose back then. Oh yeah, also, Wildfire had a 1-minute cooldown in Stormblood. Monk. Originally, Monk had a mechanic where every time they finished a 1-2-3 combo, they built a stack of Greased Lightning, making them do more damage and made their GZD faster. This stacked up to 3. 4 at some point in Shadowbringers while in Fists of Wind. This would drop to 0 if the buff ran out of its about 15-second duration. Vaguely comparable to Black Mage in a way. They also had these elemental fist stances with fire increasing damage done, stone reducing damage taken, and wind increasing movement speed and adding +1 to the Greased Lightning cap. Obviously, outside of desperate measures, what mattered was which one makes me do the big damage. At some point in Shadowbringers, both of these things were removed and instead Greased Lightning was just passively there. At the time, Monk also just had a bunch of OGCDs to use at various times, including Elixir Field and Tornado Kick. With Endwalker, the Masterful Blitz system we have now was added, but Monk still maintained a damage buff with Twin Snakes and a dot with Demolish, which were both removed with the rework of Dawntrail, to what we have now with Obey the Balls. Dragoon. Before Shadowbringers, Dragoon actually needed 3 stacks of the Gaze effect to enter Life of the Dragon. This was managed because Spine Shatter Dive also gave Mirage Dive ready. As you probably know, Dawntrail removed the need for Gaze stacks altogether. An additional note to this is Life of the Dragon gave you 3 uses of Nastrond by a different design originally. It could last 30 seconds, but Nastrond had a 10-second cooldown, so by using it on cooldown, you got, ding ding, exactly 3 uses. Dawntrail simplified this too, and then later made it so you just got one big one, which is somewhat comparable to PvP Dragoon, I guess. Ninja. Before an overhaul in Shadowbringers, Ninja's Mudras were entirely OGCD, meaning that if you were fast enough, good luck with that by the way, you could technically weave Raiton between GZDs no problem. This made the job insanely awkward to play for many, and felt very janky because of its inconsistency, as any latency whatsoever would significantly affect it. Raiton, after all, required a triple weave on a job with a GZD commonly around 2.12. It simply isn't happening. This, combined with the fact Fuma Shuriken benefited from the previously mentioned physical resistance debuffs, and it only being a double weave, made Fuma Shuriken a viable contender for a lot of players, especially those with more latency. When Mudras were made GZDs, they received significant potency buffs to compensate. And finally, Samurai. In Endwalker, Samurai lost the OGZD Kaiten, which made your next weapon skill 50% stronger. Essentially, you used this on Ninjutsus, every time. In the level range of 52 to 61, where you generate very little Kenki, this effectively meant you never had any extra for gap closers and such. But hitting 62, you had plenty to use Kaiten every time you needed to. When it was removed, Midare Setsugeka, among others, were made a guaranteed critical hit to further stabilize Samurai's performance. An additional overhaul in a way is how in Dawntrail, Tsubame Gaishi's cooldown was removed, changing it from a cooldown to more like a resource to spend. Now, admittedly, many jobs have had a lot more changes than the things I mentioned, so if you remember a thing I didn't cover or feel like I skipped over one a bit too fast, do be sure to leave a comment so we get those details as well. That said, I was surprised by how many jobs in the game have been gradually simplified and how they were simplified over the years. Do let me know. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, Adloquium crits simply doubled the barrier size, leading to a huge payoff for deployment tactics if you happen to be lucky. Shadowbringers added recitation, removing the luck element of this, justifying the nerf of this colossal payoff.